Okay, welcome everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you, Alison, for the introduction there. And as Alison's alluded to, this session is entitled Just Enough, Why We Need to Question Our Assumptions and Evidence, and we're delighted that you've been able to join us. I'm just to get some introductions out of the way. I'm Stella Jones-Devitt from Sheffield, Hallam University, as you can see, where I'm Head of Student Research and Evaluation. And the session is co-led with my colleague who's sitting alongside me here, Alan Donnelly, who you'll hopefully hear some very exciting things from later. And Alan works as a researcher in student experience and engagement. As Alison's alluded to, we're hoping to run for about 30 minutes, but then we'll also have some time for some activities and a bit of chat box stuff. And we're hoping that the session will generate lots of ideas and interactions. All of us are interested, obviously that's why we're here, about the contested nature of evidence and its use, particularly for enhancement purposes within the context of higher education. Hopefully people can hear me. We won't, as Alison said, be asking for verbal responses during the session, so there won't be need for microphones. And in recognition of that, I will be also referring to the slides quite openly and possibly reading them, just to make sure that if people can't see but they can hear, it covers most eventualities. To reiterate, we'll be asking you to contribute if you wish to by putting stuff in the chat box commentary, and it will be available for those who can't join now. It'll be available after the session. So throughout this webinar, we'll be encouraging you to think about how this relates to your own context and enhancement ambitions. We think that's really important. So if you get a chance, do introduce yourselves within the chat box. Hopefully your typing is a bit better than mine. And let's hope that we have some interesting dialogue as we get going. So I'll just run through what we're going to cover. As you can see there, we will be thinking about what counts as credible evidence, and Alan later on will be referring to some of the contested nature of what might constitute credible evidence, and I'm sure there will be lots of interesting views on what counts as credible. We'll also be exploring the use of hierarchies of evidence, and we're suggesting that these should carry a health warning. More will be revealed about that later. We'll also be investigating the impact on decision-making and methodological approaches that really being driven by evidence in a particular way might imply. And then we'll be really idealistically, I suppose, creating possible reconceptualizations for you to think about and hearing about yours concerning the value of types of evidence and its application within an enhancement context. And I suppose just to state that our starting point here is that key to this is the assumption that scientific evidence is now applied in a higher education context, and we can think about what the nature of scientific means and also about whether we think that that's for better or worse. So let's perhaps get into this in a bit more detail with considering the idea that everything in a higher education context now apparently needs to be evidenced. And there is a view, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, that if you can't measure it, it really doesn't exist. Here we're thinking about the types of evidence, and we'll be coming back to these in more detail in a moment, but the idea that really, does the type of evidence that you look at depend on the nature of the question that you're asking? We will be thinking about evidence as facts, or whether we actually do need 50 shades of grey. Please don't worry, there's not going to be any further graphic content appearing on that. And your perspective, we'll argue, might be determined from your vantage point rather than being some fixed notion of what's factual. And then we'll be looking at evidence that fits. And I'm going to suggest that there are indeed many false inferences drawn from assumptions, and we might want to really think about whether our assumptions are evidence informed in the first place. And then something on evidence that suits, and this idea, if I can get my teeth around it, of paralysis by analysis, and that there is much made of scale and how that paralysis can ensue. So just expanding a little bit on these bullet points. So for example, with types of evidence, you might want to consider what do you need to answer about your own practice, and therefore what kind of evidence needs to fit there. And perhaps here the types of evidence gathered about retention data, for example, might or might not fit the purpose. For example, in reality, does something like attendance monitoring actually provide meaningful insights into why our students drop out or consider dropping out? In terms of evidence as facts, we know that our students come from a range of backgrounds, and therefore the reality of higher education context might be perceived of and experienced differently. That's quite unsurprising, I would argue, but it's interesting that there seems to be an assumption that there's a one-size-fits-all, and therefore perhaps the cherishing of evidence as facts per se needs to be revisited. And I'm reminded here of David Seedhouse's work, where he talks about opinion being dressed as fact. And then the idea of evidence that fits. And guilty as charged here, lots of us start with assumptions and then rush, often maybe unconsciously, to find the evidence that suits. For example, if you think about the immediate rush to look for skills deficits in the BME student population as a primary explanation in the attainment gap, there's been quite a lot of talk about that. And yet we know that when we look at wider sector evidence, it indicates that deficit models, particularly those where the onus of responsibility is located with the individual student, don't work, and they really do obfuscate the real issues of institutional change and privilege. And yet, ironically, these skills-based interventions are still popular. So we're going to really suggest that it might be time to change and time to think a bit differently. And there's the stuff around paralysis by analysis as well. And the idea that if you do nothing other than gather more evidence, you need to then do more of it. So we either say evidence is discredited as being too granular, i.e. it's too specific to make wider claims, or it's actually too crude to apply in a specific context, in which case it's not helpful enough as it's too generic. And what we end up there with is a lot of inertia. So we'll see what we think about that. So we'd like you to think about responding to our questions here that are raised via the chat box. And as you can see here, the questions relate to this idea of something being too granular to be meaningful, i.e. too finely grained, or something that's too generic or homogeneous to act upon. So we'd be really interested to hear from you around how much of an evidence base do you think is just enough to be able to take action. And also, can you think of examples in which there's been this idea of paralysis by analysis? And are there any optimum circumstances relating specifically to enhancement processes? So how do you judge all of this? And has anybody out there fallen victim to, I certainly have, this idea of the too granular and too crude dichotomy? And what are the optimum circumstances for taking evidence-informed action? And perhaps here I'm thinking about such things as whether you also look at trends rather than snapshot analyses, which I think we're all under pressure to do. Whether you consider pre-existing sector benchmarks in addition to your own evidence, how do you actually assess your situation? So we'll give you a few minutes to think about that, and we'll see if we get some responses. Okay, Alan and Liz has just responded there. She's talking about the concept of evidence of inequality. Okay. The quality of evidence is key. I mean, we will be coming back to that within the session. Absolutely. thanks, Susan, about the quantitative and qualitative to the context. I suppose also, as we talk later on, we might be arguing that some forms of triangulation are clearly privileged, and we will be unashamedly expressing a preference for perhaps slightly different ways of working. So there's some good stuff going on in the chat box there. Yeah, the idea of stakeholders, I think, are critical to the debate as well. That's a really interesting point from Catriona as well, about that perhaps the subject-specific differences and data as truth. And I think certainly I struggle with that. I come from a health and wellbeing background, but actually from the policy side. And I know a lot of colleagues cherish the idea, and it's obviously very important sometimes, particularly when we're dealing with patients, that we actually do have some safety net approaches to evidence. So there's some interesting differences, I think, in a disciplinary focus. We'll just give it a couple of minutes more because we've got plenty of time for people to respond, and you can respond to each other. Somebody else there is talking about paralysis by analysis. Yes, we feel your pain. Okay, I think we'll let that roll, and by all means, you know, we want to make this as flexible as possible and pick up on these within the chat box. But we will just move the slides on slightly. But please do continue to talk about this stuff. But we'll think now about moving to the notion of evidence-informed decision making, and you can see here we are, Alan and I, talking about the idea of evidence proxies and this constant challenge of perhaps coping with evidence that purports to be what it is, but actually we all know that it's a cipher or a proxy. So, for example, with NSS, with TEF, and I'm sure a range of things that we could talk about. Also, the idea of that the only form of evidence is that which is empirical, that if we can only capture what's seen, we're going to argue that we might miss a lot of important factors. And then something that seems to be coming to the fore more and more, the idea of good news evidence and the concept of the what works pressures. We're all under pressure to find the magic formula for what works, and perhaps that at times leads to underreporting of lessons learned. So to expand on these in a little bit more depth, in terms of the methodological challenges, for example, if you take the idea that the sector's guided to extrapolate teaching excellence, for example, from a range of indicators where we might have student satisfaction, attainment levels, non-continuation rates, graduate outcomes for employment and or further study, that's all well and good, but lots of us as providers claim to transform our students' lives and are confident that we do so. But I'm not quite clear that we've seen compelling evidence to suggest that we can either A, measure that, and B, find some formula to claim transformation, should we wish to. Thinking about the empirical evidence, and I'm a fan of Kuhn's work here about the idea of false empiricism and whether it applies here, in which only that which is observable or viewable is noted, valued, and perhaps reported, most importantly. And taking this notion to its illogical conclusion, which you'll find I love to do, the statement perhaps here that applies is that all doors are green until you see a red one. Sounds bizarre, but actually, are we really prefacing that kind of thinking? And there's lots of application here to higher education. So, for example, students might believe that exams are really the best way to measure their learning because it's what's known and they evidence it experientially. Likewise, staff might be averse to using negotiated assessment because they know that their university's regulatory infrastructure is inflexible. Furthermore, we've then got this idea of good news evidence. And in this context, there's an understandable focus on evidencing what works as a mechanism for student success, rather than reporting lessons learned, which might be perceived as damaging to academic reputation. Yet there's some work by Dawson and Dawson which is really interesting, and we will provide a full annotated bibliography of anything that we mention here. And they note that this underreporting can actually lead to risk aversion and a stifling of innovation for enhancement purposes, and that's without even considering the ethical challenges of researchers only focusing on what we might call positive evidence. So that's probably enough from me. I'm going to pass you over now to Alan, who is going to now talk you through some really interesting ideas, and I think we'll have quite a lot of discussion concerning the credibility of evidence and why certain hierarchies of evidence have gained ascendancy, but we're going to argue should be challenged. So there'll be a slight pause while we just change over.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. So Grossier and Buskist proposed this definition of evidence-based teaching, which you can now read on screen. Evidence-based practice is a movement that has grown from the disciplines of health and medicine, where it was argued that evidence-based practice was needed to make effective clinical decisions for the care of the patient. There was particular emphasis on using experimental scientific research to produce empirical evidence and to challenge ineffective practices based on bias and habit. The scientific method is usually comprised of a process of making observations, constructing hypotheses, experimenting, analysing results, and making conclusions. Similar expectations around the use of evidence and using research to show what works are now dominant in education. For instance, the Department for Education has made arguments for greater use of randomised controlled trials in response to a perceived lack of robust evidence in the sector. Just to stress that from this point onwards, I will refer to randomised controlled trials as RCTs. So I just want you to start thinking about whether or not you agree or disagree with this definition of evidence-based practice. So this, of course, raises several questions about the relationship between research and practice in education. The first question that springs to mind is whether this medical model can be adequately applied to evaluate best practice in education. The second question is which types of evidence are considered to be acceptable or valid? What should the evidence base look like? Next, are the favoured scientific research methods appropriate? Once this evidence and knowledge has been produced, how will it be translated into practice? And finally, which groups are responsible for its implementation? What is the role of practitioners, policymakers, and organisations in this process? What is the mediation process to connect evidence and practice? So this is an example of a hierarchical model proposed in both medical and educational research as a way of evaluating the quality of evidence. Before I argue why it is not that useful for enhancement purposes, I will present a brief overview of the model. At the peak of the pyramid are experimental research approaches, which are considered to be the gold standard of evidence. These approaches, such as RCTs, seek to establish whether an intervention is having a causal, measurable impact on student learning, behaviour, and outcomes. Participants are randomly allocated into an intervention group or a control group where they may be given a standard intervention, a placebo, or no intervention at all. The results are statistically analysed to determine whether there is a difference between the intervention and the control group. If there is a difference in the results, then this should be due to the influence of the intervention. So just to give you a bit of context, a real-life example of a RCT could be the impact of class size on students' learning, or another example would be the impact of a teaching development program on student attainment. So at the top of the pyramid are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which summarize the results of studies with the most rigorous designs. Further down the pyramid are non-experimental forms of research, where cause and effect cannot be established, such as descriptive research and case studies. These are more difficult to generalize the findings of these approaches to the wider population. At the bottom of the pyramid are types of evidence which are considered to be unscientific and untested, such as ideas taken from professional practice and at risk of being influenced by bias. I will be arguing why this model needs to be abandoned to ensure that the contribution of professional knowledge in the enhancement decision-making process is not minimized. There needs to be a consideration of the merits and demerits of each type of evidence. So let's begin to consider a small selection of the arguments made for and against the application of this medical model to education. Advocates of evidence-based practice have posited that RCTs are the best way of determining what works and which interventions are the most cost-effective. This point is particularly relevant at the moment due to the growing focus on demonstrating value for money in education by the government. A systematic review by Donnelly and colleagues produced earlier this year found that over 80% of the RCTs in educational research have found evidence of the effectiveness of interventions that have been examined. So RCTs have a clear role in contributing to the evidence base, but to what extent is disputed, as we will soon go on to explore. Another benefit of experimental research is that it reduces selection bias by ensuring that the two groups receiving the interventions are closely matched, thereby taking into account pre-existing differences. Researchers can be confident that it is only the interventions which are influencing the outcomes. These findings can be applied across similar conditions and generalized. Another premise is that practice should be based on sound evidence rather than on tradition or outdated research. That education is far too important for it to be driven by practice that is informed by opinion, and that there is a responsibility for those involved in teaching and learning to ensure that they are using the most effective methods. However, many scholars have argued that evidence-based practice presents a reductionist view of knowledge. There is recognition that practices are influenced by values and by external educational and political factors. RCTs can certainly provide useful evidence about the effectiveness of an intervention, but it is vital to consider the local context and the barriers and enablers of implementation by using other methods to capture process evaluation. Researchers found that approximately only 1/3 of RCTs in educational research have included a process evaluation component. Observations, interviews, and case studies, among others, can capture compelling, rich narratives of the experiences of students and staff members. The argument here is to recognize the importance of heterogeneity in research design. If you are going to use a RCT, another consideration is to include subgroup analysis to determine whether there is variation in the effect of interventions across specific groups of students, such as gender, age, or socio-economic background, rather than only focusing on the overall effect of the intervention. Critics have also accused evidence-based practice of undermining the professional judgment of teachers by not recognizing the context of the teaching environment. This promotes a model of inquiry that knowledge can be transmitted in a top-down fashion. In 2015, Hammersley raised the point that teachers will naturally adapt their teaching in response to their students, rather than provide a standardized teaching experience. There is growing recognition that practitioners need to develop the skills to critically evaluate and appraise sources of evidence to be able to determine which aspects are appropriate and transferable to their own practice. Another objection to the use of RCTs is that it is unethical to withhold an intervention to individuals who could benefit, particularly when these advantages relate to health and education. It is argued by some that it is only ethically permissible to recruit to interventions when researchers are confident that no participants will be denied beneficial treatment. Others refute this by stating that the objective of RCTs is scientific rather than therapeutic, and that withholding treatment is necessary to robustly evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention. If you want to find out more about ethical best practice, please watch the previous webinar in this series that was presented by my colleague Liz Austin. It contains some really useful ideas and resources, so please have a look at that. It is becoming clearer that the types of knowledge generated by research are not sufficient on their own to meet the needs of those required in teaching and learning. Evidence should comprise of a range of sources of information and both formal and practitioner knowledge to address the unpredictable and complex challenges that occur in education. Nelson and Campbell used the term evidence-informed practice to describe the integration of professional judgment, system-level data, classroom data, and research evidence. It is necessary to stop privileging experimental research and start to consider which types of evidence can be used in conjunction with one another. Perhaps there should be less emphasis on the what and more focus on the application of evidence. In 2013, Levin developed this framework to explain how the mobilization of knowledge is connected through structural, organizational, and personal connections. At the heart of this idea is the need for social interaction and co-creation of knowledge through collaboration between stakeholders in organizations. This framework brings together those responsible for the production of knowledge, such as universities, the users of knowledge, such as practitioners and students, and finally, those involved in connecting research and practice, such as research centres and think tanks. Innovation does not happen in isolation, but through networks and communities. It is vital to create opportunities for communication and capacity building, and to develop shared understandings around the use of evidence in education. To find out more information about co-creation, you might also be interested in the next webinar taking place in December. This webinar is named Gathering Together, Working Alongside Students in an Evidence-Critical Environment, and it will be delivered by Jill Devine. So we have some questions for you to respond to within the chat box. These questions concern: would you challenge the pyramid hierarchy of evidence? And if you had to construct a new order, what would it look like? So we'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts if you want to enter them into the chat box. So we'll just take a few minutes now just to look over those responses. So you might want to think about what we have discussed so far and to reflect on your own practice. For instance, are there certain types of evidence which you deem to be more valuable than others? Can you think of any examples of previous research that you've undertaken where, in hindsight, it would have benefited from using a conjunction of methods that allow you to gather both subjective and objective data? Yep. So Liz commenting there on just the need to champion qualitative approaches, which I completely agree with. Yes, and the importance of context, which this is where, coming back to the point I made before, you need to understand, you need to find out, how certain interventions work in the local context for it to stand any chance of it, for it to thrive, and for it to be then to be used elsewhere. So I would argue that it is necessary to ask not only what works, but why, where, and how it works. To use a range of complementary research designs that enable you to answer the question most appropriately, rather than being restricted by those that are deemed to be the so-called gold standard of evidence. Okay, so some of the responses are still coming through now, and yeah, completely agree with that. So each of the approaches will be useful in different contexts. So I think the most important thing is just to remember that to use a range of different methods, that it isn't just about being restricted by one type. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, it's great that all the responses are coming through. Like I said, these will be available to look back on, and we'll certainly reflect on these towards the end. And after the session, we can keep the conversation going. But I'm going to hand back over to Stella, who will finish this webinar with you.
Okay, everybody, it's me again. There's some great stuff going on in the chat box. I'm only so sorry that my typing is so poor that I really can't join in fully. But as Alan's mentioned, these will be available as a record, and we're very happy to carry on the dialogue beyond this point. So we've heard there from Alan about how important the what and the how is as a form of knowledge mobilization, I think, rather than just about evidence, in asking questions about evidence. And I want to round this webinar off by suggesting that a fundamental step forward might even be to reconceptualize our thinking about evidence as a more fluid process. And I know some of you have already alluded to this. It's great, isn't it, thinking that you've got an original thought, but lots of you appear to already have thought it. Never mind. So this, I'm going to argue, might be the best way to get meaningful enhancement. Looking at this concept of reconceptualizing evidence, I'm going to get a plug in here for the Bauhaus, which next year is its 100th centenary. If you haven't visited that, and even if you're from a non-arts-based subject, I would absolutely implore you to have a look at it. There is some fantastic stuff on there, and talk about being ahead of its time in terms of teaching and working with students in a different way. But one of the things that interests me from the Bauhaus, which I'll refer to in a little bit more detail, is this idea of deschooling, which helps us to look at the world in a different way. There's also things about evidencing the unintended, and how if we don't have our mindset switched on to that, only capturing the observable, we may miss or devalue lots of useful stuff, and I'll come back to why I've used the word stuff shortly. And then my big idea, I suppose, is that I'm going to suggest we require what I've called an evidence osmosis, where we absolutely move from getting hung up about credibility to actually thinking about mobility and dynamism with how we actually mobilize knowledge. In taking those points in turn, while you're carrying on the dialogue and also thinking about this, the teachers at the Bauhaus Institute had an idea of unlearning or deschooling, that we need to unlearn our assumed practices in order to innovate. and that this is actually needed to unblock our thinking about evidence. And we can all probably think of examples, I certainly can, in higher education, in which we somewhat unquestioningly follow routinized procedures without really thinking whether there's a more effective and creative approach we could take. There are things around evidence in the unintended as well, that if we don't have a more creative mindset when we're considering evidence, lots of this stuff is missed. And the use of the word stuff here is synonymous of messy evidence. I'm really interested in the concept of messy evidence, in which any enhancement work, as we all know, that stuff happens. And having a flexible perspective concerning what counts as valid evidence can perhaps position impact and application in a different way if we're open-minded to it. And then the idea of osmosis, and I was trying to think of a word and recently came across this. I was thinking about this from school days. And for those of you who perhaps haven't revisited it till school days, and I was one of these people, it involves the movement of two solutions across what we'd call a relatively porous wall or membrane until there is almost an even concentration in both solutions on both sides of the membrane. And I'm going to suggest that this might be a way forward for how we mobilise evidence and knowledge and ultimately practice. So here's my big idea. Let's look at the norm of our evidence base. In the diagram on the top left, we can see that there's messy process-based evidence there, and it's trying to get through this wall, but with very little success. So here the wall or membrane signifies what I would call dominant attitudes, beliefs and practices that we've just explored, and there's some great stuff in the chat box about this, about what constitutes proper evidence. When we have that almost sticking or rigidity, levels remain relatively constant and therefore nothing much changes. And I'd argue that this sounds and looks familiar in many higher education concepts. I'm being optimistic here, but I'm going to suggest that the diagram on the bottom, at the bottom right, is much more hopeful for a future in which there's a much more fusion of messy and traditional forms of evidence. Or I'm going to say ultimately ways of knowing and being. Probably sound a bit sociological there, but there we go. The wall here, if we need a wall, is much more porous, allowing evidence to flow each way. As a result of this, there is hopefully more learning, progress, and ultimately mobilization of knowledge in a more effective way. The critical factor in the process is the wall, and how open it is to welcoming new forms of evidence. Perhaps the most important question to ask here about evidence in higher education, though, doesn't concern the evidence itself, but concerns the way we develop and build our walls to still preserve rigour. And there's been a lot of talk. I love the rigor mortis thing, and I think, yes, we'll all be stealing that as a title. But perhaps whilst still being open to new ways of knowing and being. And one thing to think about when you log off here today, perhaps a key action concerns, and you may already be doing this, concerns considering whether some of the walls really need knocking down and rebuilding in order to accelerate evidence for enhancement, or even fundamentally, do we really need walls in the first place? So we're going to finally leave you with a few things to ponder and suggest, what are the implications for your work? Clearly people on here are passionate about their work for evidence for enhancement purposes. What are the implications of all of this for your work? I'm sure lots of you are already thinking about this. And what are the takeaway messages from this webinar? Perhaps from the fact that somebody a bit bonkers talked about osmosis in a different context. Just to remind you that we'll also be providing an annotated bibliography of hopefully the interesting sources, and to build on the earlier activity, we'll provide you with a new order template that you can play with and to your heart's delight. And clearly some of the sources that are mentioned in the chat box, we'll do our best to incorporate those as well in the annotated bibliography. So to kind of round off, we hope that you have got something from this, and we would like to continue this debate. We're all very much at the start of what we'd call a new order, I suppose, in our view. And we really would like to thank you so much for your time and quite clear engagement in a lot of quite dense discussion about evidence and knowledge. So Alan and I will thank you and say please do stay in touch, and let's continue the debate. That would be great. Thanks so very much, everybody. Pass you now back to Alison.